Coming up with This Week in Computer Hardware, Raspberry Pi 4 is stupid fast. Alienware Co-founder headed to AMD. LEDs do not make coolers cool better. DisplayPort 2.0 Spec released, and the Steam Summer Sale makes us happy. All that and more coming up next on Twitch.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twitch.
This is Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, episode 523, recorded on June 27th, 2019. Raspberry Pi 4, the win. This episode of This Week in Computer Hardware is brought to you by Gazelle, the trusted online marketplace for buying and selling used devices. Visit gazelle.com/twit to buy a certified pre-owned device and get 10% off your purchase. Welcome to Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, Twitch weekly show that aims to bring you all the hardware news. And we've got everything from Internet of Things to Internet of Awesome and more than a soup con, I'd say a bucket load of gaming excitement for everybody. From PC gamers to people who love the little tablets that run the iOS. I guess technically it's not iOS, but we'll get into that in a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Sebastian Peak is still benchmarking, but does not look to be suffering from the usual benchmarking ills.
Okay, I'm hiding it well then because I am what did Steve Jobs call it? A bag of hurt when he was talking about Blu-ray. I'll borrow that expression. I was up till 3 o'clock in the morning this morning benchmarking. I was back at it again starting at about 8 a.m. So this is my life right now. Thank you, Windows 1903.
I don't know if you can see, over this shoulder is a replacement torque converter for a TH400 transmission I'll be dropping on Saturday morning. So if it makes you feel any better.
Yeah, that's more painful. Plus, it's physically painful.
So, I feel your pain in a different way. It's funny, right over here, you can't see it, but you can see it if I hold it up like this. Is something I'm incredibly excited about, and someday I'll actually get it to the center of the screen. Raspberry Pi Model 4. Which you're not going to be able to see streaming as the colors change. But there is USB-C on this critter. There is micro HDMI on this critter. There are more ports on this critter. It is an exciting update, none of which, as I reach for the mouse for the Raspberry Pi instead of for the laptop I'm connected to, none of which is nearly as exciting as the fact that they put a whole bunch more memory on this beast. And if you've been looking for more performance, this is pretty exciting. 1, 2, or 4 gigabytes of RAM options. Like I mentioned before, USB-C for the power supply, 2 micro HDMI supports supporting up to 2 4K displays, USB 2, USB 3, gigabit Ethernet is on the board now. This is a whole lot of updates to my favorite single board computer. There are a lot of other single board computers out there. And we've talked about many of them. The advantage the Raspberry Pi has, of course, is the huge amount of support, the huge community that's developed around it. It may not be as powerful, or at least in the past was not as powerful. But if you were new to the Linux environment, or you were a Linux noob, or you just didn't want to run Linux at all, and you just wanted to download something and install in the Raspberry Pi, there are so many packages and so many options to turn this little box right here into a pretty slick appliance, whether you're talking about streaming Plex or using it as an audio streamer or using it for, monitoring the bathrooms in your office and switching lights on and off to let people know when they could walk the 60 yards across the office without without being denied. Oh man, yeah. 4 gigabytes of RAM, I think, is really, 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 really huge. I am kind of ridiculously excited about that.
The market agrees with you on that 4 gigabyte of RAM choice, by the way. I think it was that same day when this launched a couple days ago that it was unavailable, at least from the outlets I checked. It was out of stock this morning when I was looking.
This is pretty normal for a Raspberry Pi launch. They launch it, everything sells out, they refill the channel, and over time, it slows down. It's interesting. You can back order on Newark, which is Element 14. It's exciting. I like Raspberry Pis. Having more memory is a really, really big deal to me. Let me say it one more time. It's available with up to 4 gigabytes of RAM. And it's a much more powerful. It feels like I haven't benchmarked it yet. It feels like a much more powerful in day-to-day use processor. I don't believe it's that big of a gap. So it may actually simply be the memory update that is making it so smooth to do things like operate more than one application at a time and switch between them without going. I will say that my favorite uses for Raspberry Pis are still dedicated distros that are acting as, for me, one of my favorites, of course, is dedicated audio streaming devices, connecting a Raspberry Pi to a small DAC and using that to distribute music around my house or power a DAC to power a unit. Reboot times are also really fast, I'm noticing. Because I just relaunched it after an operating system update. So I'm kind of like, I'm excited. If you're not into single board computers, that's okay. We have more news for you. I just wanted to
you will
mention
be
this.
if you go to somebody's house and they have one of these set up and they have like RetroPie or something on it. And you're like, oh, this is amazing. What is this? It's a $35 Raspberry Pi board. You'll probably want one too.
Oh my goodness, it's really. I have to stop because I keep turning around and going like, it's so fast, it's so smooth, it makes me so happy. I'm going to stop now before I irritate you as much as I'm irritating myself. I'm just going to say one thing about this next story. WCCF Tech, Intel. Well, basically, Intel says AMD is now a formidable competitor. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Intel's Circuit News managing editor Walden Kirsch talks about AMD in general. This is on an article posted on Reddit, and how they both have engaged the tech industry's single longest running business rivalry, which I like it spinning that way. Oh, we've been battling with them for decades now. So and Intel, it is interesting to see Intel actually not only acknowledge AMD, but realize that, it's funny, right? Because at the same time, they're like, AMD is now a formidable competitor, but we're 10 times the size of AMD in terms of revenue. And we're huge. But yeah, key competitive threats to Intel are from high-end products. AMD offers high-performance CPUs. AMD has recently been gaining some traction and winning public cloud offerings. AMD's upcoming next-generation Zen Core products, codenamed Rome for servers and Matisse for desktop, will intensify our desktop and especially server competition. The latter is likely to be the most intense in about a decade, which is Intel saying, outside of desktop and servers, Intel's competitive position in notebooks and business PCs is stronger as customers value specific aspects such as productivity, performance, battery life, and overall manageability, where Intel has clear advantages versus the competition. Of course, a year ago, Intel had clear advantages over the competition in desktops and servers. There's also a brief mention of the advantages that because AMD is no longer using global foundries, they're using TSMC, they have access to 7-nanometer process. I think it's going to be super interesting to see where this is. I thought it was interesting for Intel to be kind of actually actively communicating like that. That's a big change for Intel. So A, thumbs up for Intel for communicating. B, thumbs up for Intel for acknowledging that it has competition. And also they discuss some stuff like where they are faster, where they have an advantage. It's an interesting read. WCCF Tech and, of course, the original Reddit article is worth taking some time to digest, especially on the data center side of things.
Exactly. That's going to be huge for them, because if you think about consumer side, yes, AMD is going to have really, really compelling products and has since Ryzen launched, for enthusiast desktop. But enthusiast desktop is pretty small compared to the world at large, who are mainly on laptops at this point. And Intel still has the lead in laptop CPUs. At least they're in almost everything. There's a few. We've seen some new models come out this year with some Ryzen processors in them. On the laptop side of things, AMD is a little bit behind. They were trying to get all the desktop stuff out at 7-nanometer before moving on to 7-nanometer for laptop. They're still on 14-nanometer there. They're on Zen Plus. So, but But for enthusiasts, and then much bigger potential market for them would be the enterprise side. And if Epic comes out with, extremely high core counts, very competitive pricing, good power and thermal numbers, then I don't know why you'd be compelled to go with Intel if you're getting a better value. And it's not just about value at that point. They look at like longer term returns when you're making a huge investment in like a infrastructure for your network, for your back end, for your servers. It makes a lot more sense to go with something that's going to be more efficient, and we'll see what they can do with 7 nanometer on the desktop side. It's like they've been pushing as hard as they can go with 7 nanometer to get the clock speeds up, and they're not necessarily any lower. Like the numbers we were briefed on as far as wattage and stuff from E3, so everybody who had their preview already waiting for these new Ryzen processors to come out, the numbers are like 95 watt TDP, 105 watt TDP, a couple 65 watt parts. So it's not like the move to 7 nanometer took them down to like 45 watts or anything. They're just pushing clock speeds, pushing performance. So I'll be curious to see where the balance is. We're not really on the enterprise side at PC Perspective, but I have kind of followed the server side along with some of these refreshes Intel has come out with. And they've got like 20-30% improvement in like performance per dollar on some of their SKUs, but they're obviously very concerned about what the value proposition is that AMD is going to have.
And it's a huge value proposition. If you're looking at people who are, hardcore gamers, hardcore creatives, hardcore engineers, workstations, the amount of cores they have and the performance they're getting, especially if that underclocked next gen Ryzen 3000 part we saw a couple weeks ago turns out to be legit, you're talking about getting thousands of dollars of Intel performance out of a $500 CPU. That's tough. I don't really know how Intel fights that without massive price drops and changing any of a number of things and how they do business. You took a look at Corsair's. You found Corsair's PCI Express 4.0 SSD on pre-order for $249. What's the first motherboard we're even going to see using this thing?
Well, I mean, any of the X570 boards will support it. I know AMD, they're big on this and the Gigabyte SSD as well. I think those are the two that will be shipping first. I want to say Corsairs will be first to market. So don't be surprised if you see some MP600 reviews right off the bat once people start getting those X570 boards in for review. And I know people have been posting pictures and there's always leaks and everything, but this came via Amazon pre-order. That was in Japan, I believe, and then there was also one in the U.S. that was taken down right away. But we're talking $249 for 1 terabyte, and then what is it? Is it $400 or $500 for the 2 terabyte? $450 for the 2 terabyte. If those pages were accurate when they were pulled down. So, I mean, $250. We're finally starting to see 1 terabyte SSDs selling for $99. There's this Intel.
Say it again.
I know. 10 cents a gigabyte. He's not here anymore, but Ryan, wherever you are, Shrout's Law, thank you. It took you going to Intel to do it, but we finally have 10 cents a gigabyte. And, those are fine. They're okay. They're 660p's. They're QLC. They're DRAM-less, I believe. They're not ultra high performance. But they're better performance than a spinning hard drive in most instances, and they're getting cheaper and cheaper. I'll be excited when we see. Yeah.
I was going to say, if you've been stashing tons of audio or more likely tons of video on an inexpensive rotating hard drive because space is cheap, all of a sudden you have the opportunity of moving to an SSD and having a vastly improved load time. Or just the ability. They're slow, but even a slow SSD, if you're not doing stuff that's super critical on read and write times, suddenly becomes awesome.
There's always the access times, which we forget about. It's easy to look at those big transfer speed numbers, and that's what the manufacturers always advertise, like up to 2,400 megabytes per second. And then if you actually look at it, what what you're getting, even with one that can only do 1,000 megabytes a second, is just immeasurably, well, I mean, it can be measured, but huge gains in access times over a spinning hard drive, which may or may not have powered down. Like I have a storage drive, a 10 terabyte hard drive on this one system I've been using, and it takes it a while to spin back up because of power down. And it would be a lot nicer to have very large M.2, throw it in one of the extra slots, especially if you use an ATX motherboard. Any of our listeners or viewers who are enthusiasts and use an ATX platform, or even a mini ITX platform, at this point, a lot of those boards come with two M.2 slots. So you could put your high performance boot drive on the top, flip it over. A lot of them have an underside M.2 slot, put your 1 terabyte or 2 terabyte, cold storage NVMe drive underneath. And now you can explore really small form factor PCs and not have that real performance or not like storage capacity hit you would normally get without resorting to using an external hard drive all the time.
Nothing wrong with that.
No.
Nothing wrong with that at all. And the continuing attempts at everyone in our lives to release specs far in advance of them even remotely being needed. DisplayPort 2.0 has been introduced. 16K displays are finally possible. I'm actually probably engaging more snark than this announcement actually warrants. DisplayPort 2, it has enough bandwidth for a 16K resolution display, but there's been no updates to DisplayPort since 2016, and life has changed a lot in technology and especially video in the last 3 or 4 years. VESA hasn't updated DisplayPort since DisplayPort 1.4a, and this is going to triple the bandwidth. 77.37 gigabits per second, writes PC Gamer. So it can support 8K resolution at 60 hertz for the first time with full color chroma 444. That's no compression, which is a big deal if you're a video nerd, including, quote, with 30 bits per pixel for HDR10 support. This is interesting. To put it in perspective, they talk about they refer to an excellent article on ratings, which is RTINGS, and an example of the Asus ROG Swift PG27UQ, which is a 4K monitor, does 144 hertz for a refresh rate, but when you're playing HDR games on that, which most of you aren't playing yet, but are becoming more common as we move forward, you can only run 10-bit games at 98 hertz before it does chroma subsampling, i.e. before it downgrades the color. This would be a great moment to have Robert Heron on here to discuss, can you see the difference? What is the difference? How much does it impact things? But essentially, you're looking at enough bandwidth to run two 8K displays at 120 hertz and 30 bits per pixel, two 4K displays at 144 hertz, 24 bits per pixel, 444. So, HDR becomes really, really exciting, like 10K displays, at 60 hertz, 30 bits per pixel. It's good. It also, did they actually state when they expect this to get into hardware that we can actually buy in the real world? Is that going to happen in our lifetimes or
in our lifetimes? Of course. I mean, they just announced the spec, so no, we don't have any dates on any products or anything, and nobody likes to. I would just predict that since this spec is out there now, and we have a few months until CES, maybe we'll see a 16K or 8K high refresh HDR display is probably more likely around CES time. Somebody will have one on display somewhere. I'm excited about more bandwidth because if you look at the jump from DisplayPort 1.3 or 1.4, you just have a tremendous jump and no worries about chroma subsampling, even at higher resolutions, higher refresh rates, which is fantastic. And like you said, Robert could explain it probably in a very concise and easy to digest way. But I've always thought, even though chroma subsampling looks fine from across the room when you're watching a Blu-ray, when you are in front of a computer monitor, there's something about that 444 color that makes all the difference. If you have a monitor with a high bit rate panel, like a true 8 or 10 bit panel, and a 444 connection to your PC, text looks sharper. You don't get those kind of weird chromatic aberrations around the edges of black text on a white background like you do with chroma subsampling. It gives me a headache to look at my TV connected to a PC when it's doing that. And you get like a lot of laptops, mini PCs and things don't have a lot of bandwidth coming out of them. Like maybe they're stuck on an older HDMI spec or something. And to eventually get to a place where we could have a USB Type-C connector on the side of even a small laptop and have it go to a 4 and eventually 8K TV completely uncompressed, and then all of your computer monitors are uncompressed all the way up through like the really high refresh rates and 4K and above resolutions. Right. This seems like a pretty future-proof spec, at least for the next 2 or 3 years. It's taken them 3 years to update it, so it's a good thing.
It should last at least 3 years in the real world, probably longer than that. Remember, the vast majority of gamers are still running at 1080p monitors and rather aged ones.
Yes. Vast majority. Look at Steam hardware surveys sometime. It's pretty eye-opening. When you start to think you've identified some trends, like, oh, all my friends got ultra-wides. Like, check the Steam hardware surveys. It'll bring you crashing back down to earth with more than 80% of people on 1080p monitors. And yeah. You know, I won't even talk about how it looks for AMD's market share when you look at Steam hardware surveys, but let's just say they're not in the top 10, and there's like one of the top 4.
Well, like after 1080p, the next most common monitor in Steam gaming is something that is considerably lower in resolution. It is what it is. Integer scaling coming to DX11. What's going on with yay? Intel Gen 11 graphics gets integer scaling. This feels so retro? Question mark.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're into retro games like I am, this is something that will look really nice, assuming that you can get everything that you want running on the system. So, you know, there's mods for DOSBox. I think I've talked about the DOSBox Perfect Pixel mod either on the PC Per podcast or on this one at some point in the past. But when you can avoid doing the sort of interpolation and subpixel, there's things that happen by default with a scaler, and you know, God forbid if you're using the scaler built into your monitor, right? And you know, GPU scaling can be a little bit better, and there's filters and stuff you can enable in GPU drivers to do sharpening, and we've heard about that. There was some stuff about that at E3, but integer scaling is what Apple does, and if you've ever seen an Apple Retina display, you know how that is basically the ideal way to scale a display. They take a higher resolution display than they need. They basically do 2 pixels in each direction and then use sub-pixel smoothing as well. And the combination is, it looks almost like a printed page when you look at one of their, like the 5K iMac is one of the best looking displays I've ever seen. And it doesn't look quite the same running Windows, but Windows has gotten a lot better with scaling. If it comes to the driver level, if Intel is doing a really good job of handling scaling within their graphics engine, within their driver, and they're supporting it, then it will take a lot of the guesswork out. It'll make it so that we're not waiting for additional improvements. I mean, even if you have, like, say you do 2x scaling, you have a 4K display and you're running it at like 2560 by 1440, or you're running it at 1920 by 1080, which would be like, you know, 1/2 in either direction. It can look really, really, really good. And Windows 10 looks better than any previous version of Windows as far as that kind of scaling goes. But you'll always have those apps that open up and are just a blur. They look smeared and they're not handling the 2x resolution scaling properly. They're not doing it in an integer. They're doing it in some other method that's causing it to look really, really soft. And I don't know the technical term, so I'm sorry. But the dream is integer scaling, where you go, you know, 2 to 4 and 4 to 8, and everything looks really, really, really crisp. It's that kind of pixel art look. If you were looking at it with a microscope, it wouldn't look blurry. It wouldn't look like a watercolor. It would look like pixel art or a mosaic, which is how you get those retro games looking so sharp on a modern display. But, you know, we have to wait for Gen 11 graphics, which means things that have integrated Intel graphics built into them. So not as exciting for gamers, Unless you're retro gamers, in which case, of course,
It's
any
very
integrated
exciting.
graphics are fine. Yes. And not to disparage Intel, because they're very proud of their Gen 11 graphics, but all I will ever play on them are DOSBox games. Sorry.
Well, better to have better DOSBox performance than to not.
Yes.
Yeah.
And desktop. I want to see the perfectly scaled desktop reality.
Yeah.
Make it happen, Intel.
Make it happen. Make it so, number one. Silex bot, I just wanted to mention this. You may not think silly things around your house, smaller devices, your Internet of Things stuff. You may not be thinking about security on those, but you should be. In many cases, because these devices come from the factory with minimal updates from whatever raw code came from the manufacturer, and it can be unpleasant. Or they can be a security hole in an otherwise fairly secure home. Or in the case of SilexBot, the crew over at Akamai found this one, caught it on honeypots. It is bricking, or was. It looks to have been shut down, but it was literally bricking Internet of Things devices if you had the default password. If you set something up, didn't change the default password, and let it run, which could include, I believe, things like routers, it would take data and randomly write it over any storage it found on the device. And then, of course, that would kill the device. And, unless you for an average user, probably run the device unrecoverable, or in some cases for a not so average user. And what was really crazy about this is, Larry Cashdollar wrote this up for Akamai's blog, and apparently the person who claimed to be doing it was a 14-year-old boy from Europe, and was just kind of, I guess, pissed off at the universe and looking for an opportunity to flex his coding muscle and destroy some stuff. And what was crazy, it was targeting any Unix-like system. So anything that behaved like it had Linux or some variation of Linux or Unix on it, it would run if it found default login creds. Man, it would just stomp on them, mostly ARM devices. So just basic security precautions, people. Change passwords, change logins when you can, even for the little stuff. Because A, it sucks if small expensive things, or even small cheap things are destroyed. And B, you never know what somebody might use as an entryway to do more nefarious things on your home network. I just want to say that. Good passwords. Make sure you do not use default passwords. Try not to use default logins if you have an option. Because in this case, a few thousand people had their stuff bricked. Fortunately, it was shut down, I believe, fairly quickly. Change your passwords, set up passwords before somebody with more resources decides to run something just as nasty. Oh, my goodness. This episode of This Week in Computer Hardware brought to you by Gazelle, the trusted online marketplace for buying certified pre-owned devices. I buy stuff used a lot. The camera I'm staring at right now, bought it used. There's at least one laptop in the house and 2 tablets in this house that were bought used. I like buying stuff. It's nice to buy used things because they cost less money. Your dollar goes farther. And, you got creative goals, you got professional goals, you got personal goals. The trick is whether or not you can trust the device. And that's the nice thing about Gazelle, right? They gather things up and present them for resale. Everything from iPhone 6 through 10, a variety of Samsung Galaxy phones, MacBook Airs, MacBook Pros, iPads, standard iPads, iPad Airs, iPad Pros. Each device goes through a thorough 30-point inspection. You can pick one that's in fair, good, or excellent condition. And guess what? There's no restocking fee, right? You got 30-day return policy, free shipping. And they're sold, all their products sold without a carrier contract and are available for support by major carriers or unlocked. If you're kind of stretching things, like maybe you need that new MacBook Pro, you got a contract coming up, you need the computing power, they got financing available for all their devices with Affirm. You can pay off in 3, 6, or 12 months. You just select financing with Affirm at checkout, and they get you going on that. Gazelle's got an incredible selection of quality pre-owned devices. They are an excellent choice for students, or if you're a parent that is needing to buy devices for a student, this is a way to get them maybe something a little faster, a little more performance for less money, or to give them, something that's a treat before they head off to school in September. People, level up with new tech from Gazelle. Visit gazelle.com/twit to buy a certified pre-owned device and get 10% off your purchase. That's gazelle.com/TWIT. And we want to thank Gazelle for their support of This Week in Computer Hardware. Because, hey, we appreciate y'all making the show possible. Gazelle.com/twit is the place to go. And I've bought stuff from Gazelle. They've been around for a long time. It's nice. The official gaming and snark section of This Week in Computer Hardware is about to launch.
Get ready. Take a drink of water.
I'm ready. Okay. Everybody breathe. Brace for impact. In 3,
Stretch.
2.
Oh, it's me? Listen. Our national crisis is over. Ubuntu and Steam have gotten back together for the kids. And we don't know if it's going to stick yet. They're still separated, but they're talking. That's a start. So if you've been following the Twitters over the last week, there was a whole bunch of noise because a Valve developer went on Twitter and said that Ubuntu 19.10 and future releases, I'm quoting, will not be officially supported by Steam or recommended to our users. We will evaluate ways to minimize breakage for existing users, but we'll also switch our focus to a different distribution, currently TBD, to be determined. So this was because Ubuntu said they're going to stop providing 32-bit packages in its archives, which the long and short of this is a lot of games are 32-bit. Steam requires 32-bit libraries, and basically the end result of this was that they backpedaled a little bit. They are going to include select 32-bit libraries going forward. They've now released an official statement. Valve came back out and released another statement. And for the time being, at least up through version, I believe it'll be 20.04 LTS and 19.10, they will still be offering full support for Ubuntu. So if you're a Linux gamer, this is good because Steam has been the de facto platform as far as I know for gaming, and they had chosen Ubuntu as like their recommended distribution of Linux, even though you can download it and run it, and Ubuntu is just a Debian. It's based on Debian Linux, so you could go out and just get the official like vanilla Debian. You can go and get Open SUSE. I remembered how to pronounce it. But yes, there are Linux gamers out there, Eric. There are many of them. Enough of them that this actually made quite a splash. At least a vocal. It's not like mainstream Windows gamers and console gamers, but if you think about it, consoles are actually running Linux, so isn't everybody a Linux gamer?
Not if you don't have a console.
Well, okay, so if you don't have a console, if you don't have a PlayStation 4 or an Xbox One with whatever letter at the end of it, then maybe you only do gaming on a Windows PC, but you can do anything that doesn't rely on DirectX basically can work natively on Linux. And it's a great way to avoid paying for Windows, because all Linux distributions are free. And they make really good use of the hardware. I know that, we've been talking about AMD Ryzen processors, it seems, every week since CES.
Right.
The scheduling issues with Windows were not problematic in Linux. So if you look at Phoronix, they're a great website that does all sorts of hardware and software coverage. They base their entire test suite on Linux. And a lot of...
It's pretty awesome.
Yeah. A lot of servers run Linux. And if you look at websites like Serve the Home, their test suite is all based on Linux. And they're doing like professional grade, like enterprise level benchmarking. So there's a lot of great reasons to be on Linux. And if you happen to be on it because you don't want to worry about getting viruses, and you don't want to pay Microsoft for collecting your data, then you can also play games on it. And a lot of games, actually, not just DOSBox, which is fully supported, but a lot of games in 3D, newer titles, a lot of indie games are out there. So it's good to see that one of the most, like the highest profile distributions of Linux is going to retain the really high profile game distribution platform. to put it as long-winded a way as possible. I could have condensed this all to one sentence, but instead it's been about 4 minutes of me talking. So Patrick, please save all of us.
All I can say is I'm incredibly excited that Kerbal Space Program is on sale for 75% off. I've been meaning to buy it for a while for the boys, and I have been avoiding it for reasons I cannot remember or could not remember until I looked up at this story on the rundown, and that the summer sale of Steam had begun, and I realized Kerbal Space Simulator was 75% off. That is a lot. Basically it's $10 instead of $38 or something like that. $40, I guess, 25%. In any case, there's a ton of good games on here. If you have a Steam list that you've been waiting for, it is time to go check it and start taking a look at what is on your list that is suddenly vastly more affordable. Because I'll be honest with you, I can see Rust is on my list of stuff to buy. It's so much cooler to buy stuff cheap than it is to buy stuff expensive, at least in our world.
Yes, I liked how you put that.
Summer sale runs from June 25th to July 9. But I mean, 33% off, 10% off, 40% off, 60% off, 50% off. This is, in many cases, 10% is not a huge difference, but in some of these games, they're half off. Euro Truck Simulator 2, 75% off. Farming Simulator 19, only 20% off, which is kind of heartbreaking. One of the favorites around Twitch, which is Wreckfest. And I know I'm going to hear somebody going, woo, in the background up there in Petaluma, 50% off. Watch Dogs 2, 80% off. It's like a friend of mine's favorite game, which he keeps telling me to buy. There's just a lot of really great prices. And as always, every time I'm up on Steam and looking at stuff that I haven't looked at before, I see games I didn't know were on Steam and now want to buy. So we're going to close that tab. Because there's only so many hours in the day.
And speaking of Steam, just real quick, I know we've been talking about Steam for about 10 minutes now, but isn't it nice to use a platform that lets you do things like backup and restore your games and, has a shopping cart and doesn't make certain titles disappear when sales start? But, that's enough. That's enough.
Let it go.
Of the snark, I guess.
Let it go. If you're not going to name it, don't bother.
Fair.
Speaking of gaming, Frank Azor, the co-founder of Alienware, who's been with Alienware for 21 years now. Of course, Alienware bought by Dell. Mr. Azor's been the head of not just Alienware, but XPS at Dell. So if you like an XPS 13, if you love an XPS 13, if you've lived your life for years with an XPS 13, raise your hands and say thank you, Frank, because Frank posted up on Alienware's boards that he would be leaving Alienware. And the rumors, according to WCCF Tech, which I actually said properly, I think, that time, he will be joining AMD, which is interesting because, of course, Intel has pulled a lot of talent out of AMD in the last year or two. But he will apparently be the chief gaming officer and the first chief gaming officer at AMD. So, Alienware co-founder, vice president, and general manager Frank Azor, who's been with Alienware / Dell for almost 25 years. This is pretty huge. And I believe the first chief gaming officer at AMD. So, leaving Dell July 3rd to take on a new challenge. And a little over 21 years ago, I met a couple of lunatics who had an idea they called Alienware. When I met them and learned about the company they were trying to build, I thought to myself, this would be the coolest job ever. I was right, but none of us ever dreamed the brand would come this far, which is a result of all of you, your hard work and passion. So, I think it's going to be interesting.
There's still time to find out that he's actually going to Intel, because isn't that where everybody goes? But
just in our world.
Let's hope it's AMD just to restore balance to the force. Because if yet another person goes to Intel, then who's going to be left eventually? I'm going to wake up tomorrow and find myself in California in front of Intel's headquarters. I don't even know how I got there.
I don't think it works quite that fast, and they don't sneak into your bed at night. And if they do, shoot them. You're in Michigan. They don't have a problem with guns there. Just a thought, man. In other news, Apple's bringing Xbox and PlayStation 4 controller support to the iPhone, iPad, and Apple TV this fall. Hint, they are also bringing a subscription gaming service. And
another subscription gaming service.
Well, I mean, look, I will say I don't know if it's going to be tied exclusively to the gaming service, but they have a public beta running, and the simple fact that you won't have to use M5 Bluetooth controllers exclusively, because it's a very small collection and some of them suck more than others. But for anybody who's lived with an Xbox or a PlayStation controller, this is kind of nice, right? I think this is cool. Also, for example, the Verge article, or I should say the Verge author that wrote this one up, Tom Warren, it was cool, right? Because he was the Remote Play app supports native DualShock 4 controllers in iOS 13, so he was streaming games from his PS4 directly to his iPhone or his iPad. This is pretty slick. Xbox doesn't support this yet, but I guess in October, Microsoft will have a new console streaming remote play solution, or you can buy OneCast, which costs $12. It's a third-party app and runs with an Xbox One controller on iOS 13. So that's pretty slick, and it also will stream to your Apple TV. So this is,
that's interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty slick. In any case, that's coming, and anything that allows you to have better controls or more access to gaming controllers makes me happy. I'm not a huge. When Apple first brought gaming to the Apple TV, I bought one of the original certified controllers, and I just remember thinking, like, wow, this is like a smaller, crappier version of an Xbox controller, or I should say, actually, it was more of a PS2 controller. In any case, it's nice to see them opening up the doors to other opportunities. Scythe Mugen 5 tough cooler.
Tough.
This cools better because it has LEDs, right?
Obviously. I mean, RGBs make computers faster. And as I've discovered in my secret testing laboratory, they make coolers cooler looking, but not necessarily cooler, as you may read in the review. It's interesting looking because it's got an odd aesthetic. If you're not into the Asus TUF series, they kind of rebranded what TUF was. TUF used to be these motherboards that had like all sorts of ridiculous armor and military spec components and things. And now the TUF brand is more of kind of their entry-level brand. There's a lot of affordable gaming motherboards that have the TUF logo and this sort of color scheme that has yellow accents. So this is part of a family of things that are available out there that are part of this thing called the TUF Gaming Alliance. So they have similar aesthetic, which involves yellow and black. But when you actually get this installed, it's a Scythe Mugen 5. I tested one of these a couple years ago. It's a really, really high performance, smaller, sort of fairly inexpensive cooler. I think the Mugen 5 sells for about $48. Mm-hmm. So this version of it sells for closer to 60. The top of the heatsink, they've added this RGB cover, which separately connects to an available RGB header or daisy chains with the one on the fan. So then you have the ability to sync the top and the fan on your CPU cooler with your motherboard. And if you have one of these tough motherboards, it's going to already kind of match and just go nuts with customization and lighting effects. But as far as real performance goes, I tested it against a little group of $30 to $60 coolers, and the Be Quiet Dark Rock Slim I reviewed a couple weeks ago is still out ahead by about a degree or so, degree and a half. Okay. The Mugen 5 Tough is still very good, and it beats the venerable Cooler Master Hyper 212 Evo by about a degree. So, and it's a lot quieter than the Hyper 212 Evo. In fact, it was the second quietest cooler I've tested recently, only to that Be Quiet cooler, which has an extremely quiet, very low RPM fan. So, minimal noise output. minimal noise output and, interesting aesthetics. So if you have to like the aesthetics or be trying to match a tough board, I think, for this yellow and black with RGB colors to kind of make sense. But if you like the way it looks, I thought it was it's a good product, but it's not as compelling a value as those Cooler Master coolers, which are so inexpensive. So like $30, $35, you can get yourself one of those Hyper 212 family of coolers. This is closer to $60, so you have to want the RGBs. And then,
right.
There are RGB options that are less, but not with that top panel. So it really depends on what you like. I've never seen an air cooler with an RGB enabled cap on the top of the heatsink. So it's a first. It's 2019 and you must RGB everything.
RGB all the things. I have not figured out a way to RGB the Raspberry Pi. Perhaps I will.
You're not trying hard enough.
I probably am not trying hard enough, but I'm not really a unicorn vomit kind of guy in my aesthetic, but I am tempted. Something I don't know if something I should make really, really clear. Yes, I did say 13 times that there were 4 GB RAM versions. There's 1, 2, and 4 GB RAM versions. The 4 GB versions are pretty much sold out until August. There are Canakit, amongst others, have 2 GB RAM versions of the board that are still available. The performance on this is actually kind of impressive. One of my complaints is, even with the Raspberry Pi 3, there was still, you had to sort of launch something and be patient with it. And the processor on this one is a huge improvement. And I'm trying to, there's a benchmark that somebody ran. First of all, they finally split off. They're not running everything over. All the external ports, for example, the USB and Ethernet, are no longer run over the same USB lane, which is a big deal in terms of performance. And there it is. Cortex A72 64-bit processing core. This is a really considerably more powerful device than we've seen in the past, and to the point where in some benchmarks it is anywhere from 50% to 400% faster than a Raspberry Pi 3. In other benchmarks, not so much of a difference, but one of the things I've always done every time, and I should have said this first off, one of the things I've always done every time a new Raspberry Pi has come out is I've tried to use it as a substitute for a desktop PC or laptop, because its forte, as far as I'm concerned, is doing like sort of dedicated devices where you're streaming audio, you're streaming video, you're using it to do something in the background. It's telling you when the International Space Station is coming overhead. But this is the first time I've downloaded LibreOffice on it and started typing and not thought to myself, this is emotionally traumatizing. It actually works. So it's a little crazy, right? And it's $55 in the 4 GB version versus $35 for the 1 GB version. But it is really impressive to see how much faster this is than previous versions of the Raspberry Pi. Yeah. This is a really, it's a quad core A72 running at 1.5 gigahertz. It is way more powerful than chips we've seen in the past. So it's also a redesigned board. It's a redesigned, I want to say architecture. It's the first time they've upgraded the graphics in the history of the project. And again, that single lane USB bottleneck is gone, which is kind of freaking huge. So, just wanted to let that out there. Gigabit Ethernet, USB 3.0 ports, but depending on the benchmark, you're literally looking at 2 to 4 times the performance in a lot of different things. But one that really stood out, some of the browser speed tests, which sounds ridiculous, right? Browser speed tests. But when you're looking at an older, slower device or a relatively low-powered device, the simple act of, and browser page can be physically painful. Yes. And that's pretty much gone with the Raspberry Pi Model 4. And that sounds stupid, but if you're thinking gosh, I want something cheap that my kid probably isn't going to kill, and if they kill it, I'm not going to care what it costs, and it's just got to run Minecraft, and well, it's just got to run Minecraft, right? Then that pretty much takes out all of the options involving, for example, Chromebooks. But I don't know. I just want to say the performance on this is really impressive, and they made some significant changes to the architecture of this device. So I get excited about Raspberry Pis. I just want to let that go.
I think it's valid as a really low-cost PC alternative like you were talking about, because you can run a full OS on it, and it's gotten to the point where now it has similar specs to a high-end smartphone, which is what most people are using for a lot of tasks involving getting online, checking their email, doing the kind of stuff that used to be the job of a dedicated desktop or even a laptop. And if you look at, say you only had $40 to your name and you needed a new computer because yours is just dead, you could go into your local Goodwill, and they may or may not even sell PCs. If they do, you'd be lucky to find one for $40, and it's probably a Core 2 Duo or something. And if you've ever tried to load, in the last couple of years, a modern website on a Core 2 Duo machine, I feel sorry for you, because that's that pain that Patrick was talking about, where it just doesn't want to load the page at all. And good luck finding anything that'll run on an older version of Windows. So try to run a new version of Windows on a system that old, you're going to pay the price. So if you can run a up-to-date OS of some kind on something with this kind of power, it becomes kind of a no-brainer, because it's all there. It's all you need. You just plug in some USB peripherals and a monitor, and you've got yourself a system.
And it's also, it's funny because somebody tweeted a while back, and they didn't understand why Intel was still making like dual core processors, and they didn't understand why companies like ECS make these small, low powered devices. And I laughed because I had literally within the previous 48 hours set up a small ECS computer, right? It's not a, it's like 4 gigabytes of RAM, a dual core processor, things sold for, I think, like $150, but I needed something to operate a teleprompter. And a teleprompter is a lot of things, but it's not something that requires a lot of computing power. But it does have to work. And, it's easier, in my case, it was much, much easier to do it running Windows. There are lots of things where you don't need a tremendous amount of computing power, but a little bit more is always nice. And, I'll stop because I'll just repeat this over and over again. It's a lot faster. More memory is great. Go Pi. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, you were benchmarking until 3 a.m. you mentioned earlier. I'm going to brazenly assume that you've signed some sort of NDA that means you'll have to give up your children or some of your favorite body parts if you tell us what it is. But what can you tell us about what's coming up at PC Per?
What's coming up? We have a holiday coming up. We celebrate our nation's independence on the 4th of July. Beyond that, it's just business as usual. Lots of hardware. Absolutely nothing that I can't talk about. Nothing that I've signed NDAs about that I am willing or able to talk about, Patrick.
Okay. Well, there you have it.
Yeah. There's absolutely nothing in anything that I just said. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, you should immediately just start checking PCPer.com, every hour or so. Because whenever Sebastian says that he has nothing to say with no snark, it usually means something really impressive is coming. That's my guess. I'm just going to say. Or I'm
just totally out of ideas and there won't be any new content. But, one of those two things is probably true.
I feel comfortable in saying that you're not out of content, but stranger things will have happened. Oh, my goodness. With that, ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to This Week in Computer Hardware. We call it Twitch. You can find more episodes at twitch.tv/TWICH. That'll give you all the information on how to subscribe on just about any platform, anywhere, both the audio and the video, and, of course, links to all sorts of fascinating and exciting things. And, of course, twit.tv is the home of the rest of the Twit programming, which if you haven't checked out, it's probably time you should. Seriously, people, thank you so much for listening to This Week in Computer Hardware. You can find more of me, Patrick Norton, over at twitter.com/Patrick Norton or the eventually to be launched PatrickNorton.com. But it has been a crazy week, and I want to thank each and every one of you for listening or watching. I'm Patrick Norton.
And I'm Sebastian Peak.
Catch you next week on Twitch.